Results and the political, economic and regional security ramifications. I'm joined by Shihoko Goto, a Northeast Asia associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. And from New York, we have Jim Nolt. He was formerly based in China and is a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Shihoko, to what extent was this election solely about the economy, as we heard there from our correspondent, as we heard there from the Prime Minister himself, or did these other issues that our reporter mentioned, nuclear power, foreign policy, did they play a role as well?
Well, certainly Abe has made it clear that this was a referendum, in effect, about his own economic performance to date. And that because he has won overwhelmingly in this latest election, that he can claim a victory about his economic policy and that he can move forward with it. But at the same time, we have to step back a little bit and look at the numbers. Just over 50% of people voted, which means almost half the people actually didn't take part in this election. And so that could hardly be seen as a resounding support for his economic policy to date. And you ask about what are some of the other issues at stake. There is concern from outside of Japan and outside of Asia, the growing tension between Japan, China, and Korea. What's going on? How does this jeopardize stability in the region? That was actually not a tremendous issue in the election per se, but it will certainly be a huge issue for Abe to tackle moving forward.
Jim, looking at this result, as Shihoko points out, a low turnout, just over 50%, but doesn't the result seem a little bit counterintuitive? Because here we have a prime minister who presided over an economy that went into recession, but yet he got, despite the low turnout, an overwhelming victory.
Well, I think partly that's because of the weakness of the opposition. The Liberal Democratic Party, the largest party in the ruling coalition, has dominated Japanese politics for 60 years now, and very few governments have been in power except in coalition with the Liberal Democratic Party. So it's not necessarily just a vote for the ruling coalition as it is a kind of non-event that Japanese politics continues business as usual. And yes, to some extent you'd think because of the economic difficulties, he might suffer in at least some drop in his support, but on the other hand, he's also seen as a strong leader who's trying to do something, even though there's a lot of inertia in the Japanese system, so it's hard to make the deep changes that might be necessary to really have a dramatic recovery in the economy.
Shihoko, he's got the mandate now. It's a big mandate. What does he do with it? Is it going to be business as usual?
Well, from a U.S. perspective, an Abe victory is actually good. You have to remember that before Abe, there was 7 years of 7 different prime ministers. It's been a revolving door of leadership. It's been very difficult for Washington to deal with Japan as a result. We have Abe's victory. He will be there for another 4 years. That is good, but what does that mean moving forward? One of the things that we are hoping for is a breakthrough in trade relations, specifically on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. This has been a sore point between Japan and the United States. Of course, a lot of it depends on whether the US Congress will approve, give the White House authority to move forward with it through the Trade Promotion Authority, the TPA. And once that, if and when that does come through, it'll be easier for the Japanese, and especially the LDP in particular, to give a little leeway to some of the demands from the United States. And I think that will be one of the big issues. And I say that because one of the biggest challenges will be the third arrow of Abenomics, which is structural reform, which really needs nothing short of a social revolution in Japan.
Jim, how much of a risk was this for the Prime Minister going into this election? I mean, he called a snap election. Was it a bit of a risk that he was taken and has managed to pull off?
I wouldn't say it was a very big risk. I think what was important to him was to extend his mandate so he could negotiate on some of these foreign policy issues from a position of strength, and he's achieved that, he's extended his mandate. But he knew going into the election that he was likely to win and in fact likely to improve the margin of the ruling coalition. So I don't think it was a particularly a gamble that he called the snap election, and rather an effort to strengthen his own bargaining position.
Shihoko, I want to move on to some of these specific issues, some of those that you have talked about already. Let's talk about nuclear power in Japan. 70% of the Japanese population oppose expanding nuclear power in Japan, yet this government wants to go ahead, restart the Sendai plant. Some say because there are cabinet ministers who own stock in the company that owns the plant. But speaking more broadly, why is the government pushing nuclear energy when there is such overwhelming opposition to it?
In a nutshell, because it really has no choice but to look at the nuclear option. Japan, as you know, is very limited in its natural resources. It essentially is dependent on imported energy sources if it were not for nuclear energy. And of course, the Japanese government is really stepping up efforts to produce alternative energy technology. And I think it can be a leader in that, but it's not going to happen next year or even 5 years down the line. It's going to be a long-term investment and a strategic move that the government needs to look at. But for the here and now, you talk about shareholding. Yes, that could be a very cynical way of looking at it, but from the business perspective, nuclear is really something that is the only option that will meet the current needs. And I think given strong support for Abe and the LDP, it will be easier to move forward despite the very high public opposition to this.
Jim, one other domestic issue that has been getting some attention during this election, and that was the fact that the Prime Minister has expressed a strong desire to change Japan's pacifist constitution. That was a constitution essentially written by the United States after World War II. He wants to change that. He wants to lift those restrictions that have been placed on Japan's military. Is this part of what has been described as his nationalist agenda?
Yes, I mean, his own grandfather was a well-known nationalist politician in Japan and was prime minister during the 1950s during a previous revision of the Japanese security relationship with the United States in a more nationalist direction. And it's pretty clear that Prime Minister Abe is wanting to make a mark in this area to show that Japan has become like any other nation and not subject to special restrictions on its use of military or its development of military force. At the same time, he has to move carefully in this area because it's an issue of great concern for all the neighbors in the region, especially China, South Korea, and even the countries of Southeast Asia, all of whom have some concerns about a revised constitution and the possible increased militarization of Japan.
If I could just intervene on that point, if we look at the election results, the main opposition party, the Democratic Party of Japan, one of its campaign promises was to not have any changes in the Constitution or any reinterpretation of the Constitution, and yet it really did not perform very well in the election. One of the reasons why it did not perform well is because it didn't really have a very good, viable economic policy. But another reason is that for the average Japanese voter, this constitutional issue is not as important as seeing an improvement in their daily lives. So whilst I agree that this is a tremendous challenge for the Abe administration moving forward, it's not really at the forefront of your average voter.
So it wasn't a major issue during the election?
It was not the driving force, even though it is something that the Chinese and the Korean audience in particular, as well as the United States, is looking very closely at.
Jim, it might not be important to the Chinese voter, but it is important, apparently, to Shinzo Abe, because one of the other things he wants to do, and he said this, that he wants to portray the Japanese military in a more positive light.
Yes, you know, even though people make criticisms about the Japanese, there's a relative continuity, for example, between the pre-war and the post-war leadership compared with, say, Germany, where the Nazi Party was thoroughly purged from positions of leadership. Many of the post-war Japanese politicians were civilian leaders in the wartime government. So there's been a lot of criticism that Japan has never really taken account of its role in World War II. But at the same time, it really did deeply demilitarize. And even up till today, Japan does have a military since the 1950s, but its constitution says it has to be a self-defense force only. And as both a percentage of the population and a percentage of the gross national product, Japan's military is quite small relative to other countries and relative to countries like Germany, for example, that was such an instigator of World War II. So Japan has effectively a relatively small military, and yet Prime Minister Abe clearly wants to regularize the role of the military in Japanese society in a way that hasn't been true under the Constitution, that's uniquely in the world specified that the military is purely a self-defense force, unlike most of those in the world.
And Shihoko, this attempt to change the Constitution, to change that pacifist Constitution, how will that be viewed in Washington?
Well, it's actually called a reinterpretation, because what Abe tried to do was to actually rewrite it. That did not go through. So reinterpreting. Reinterpreting, what does that mean? That means that Japan will be able to take part in what's called collective self-defense activities that will allow its troops to join other international forces in joint exercises and joint operations. What does this mean for Washington? Certainly, for Washington, this is welcome news. Japan is the third largest economy in the world even today, even though there's been 20 years of stagnation. And also, for the United States, it plays a key role in ensuring military stability in the region. It acts as the U.S.-Japan alliance acts as a counterbalance against militarization in China and increased military spending from Beijing.
So this fits in very well with the U.S., what do they call it, the pivot or the rebalance to Asia?
Yes, certainly. So this would be seen as an integral part of the U.S. rebalance towards the region, and Washington is signaling that it greatly welcomes this approach. But it's not popular with the voters, because you have to remember that since 1945, Japan has had no casualties of war, not one. And it's because of this constitution. And Japan prides itself, even though Japan continues to be attacked from China and Korea for its aggressions in the Asia-Pacific region. For a lot of the Japanese, that is the sentiment about Japan's suffering under World War II with not one but two nuclear bombs being dropped on the country is something that resonates deeply with voters, and they don't want to forfeit that. They don't want to necessarily be part of an international collective self-defense security pact.
Okay, I also want to look at Japan's relationship with China, but we are going to have to take a break right now. We'll continue our discussion about Japan's politics and Sino-Japanese relations when we come back. You're watching The Heat.